What if the biggest barrier to EV adoption isn't public opinion, but policy design? Welcome to the EV Advisory Podcast. Today we're joined by Trevor Melanson, Director of Insights and Communications at Clean Energy Canada. Clean Energy Canada is a national climate and energy think tank focused on accelerating the country's shift to a low-carbon economy through smart policy and research. So in this episode, Trevor will unpack why EV interest is skyrocketing, especially among younger Canadians, but adoption still lags. Is it really about demand? Or are upfront costs, building codes, and charging access the real bottlenecks? Let's dive right in.
Welcome to the EV Advisory Podcast, where we provide authentic expert advice to residents and businesses across the beautiful province of British Columbia that want to install EV charging stations in their buildings. The EV Advisory is an official podcast of the EV Advisor program with myself as host, J.M. Toriel, at the Fraser Basin Council, whose location is at the Vancouver offices on the unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples, also known as downtown Vancouver. The EV Advisor program is funded by the Ministry of Energy and Climate Solutions and the Government of British Columbia as part of the Clean BC Go Electric initiative. Our outreach mission through this podcast is to serve you, the listening public, with helpful advice through conversations with leading experts. So thanks again for coming, Trevor. Really appreciate you being here, and I think it's very timely to be discussing policy and whatnot in British Columbia, but also Canada, as far as electric vehicles go, and the work that we do, and a lot of the writing that you've done. But what was your actual aha moment where, that got you into the EV ecosystem initially, or maybe something that you were writing about because you've got a background in journalism? So.
Yeah, I would say so. I joined Clean Energy Canada in 2016. So Nissan Leafs and early Teslas were on the road, but EVs were definitely an early technology at that point. And we did a bit, like the organization, we did a bit around EVs, but we weren't known for electric cars in the way that we are now. And really where I saw it first and where I was pushing it was on social media. It was on Facebook, where when we posted about electric vehicles, even those early days, we were getting very good results. It was very consistent. There was very high levels of engagement. And at the time, I was bringing this up, and folks were saying, well, aren't EVs a little bit elitist? I don't know if we should talk about them. And I was pointing to what I was seeing, the digital trends I was seeing, and saying, this is what's getting people's attention. And increasingly, kind of starting from that realization, we moved into this space, and EVs have, of course, evolved from a luxury vehicle to, well, some people would still say a luxury vehicle. I would say it's an everyman vehicle at this point, and especially if you do the long-term cost calculations.
Oh yeah, and definitely a lot more models available too, comparatively to the 2016. And we'll get into this later because I know your more recent report does actually an analysis of that. But let's go to like the research data that's just come from Abacus, I believe you work with. The report called Empowering Households that's just been put out, I think, this month.
Yep.
Showed that despite a tremendous amount of misinformation and inaccurate assumptions about electric vehicles, there was a 23% market share in sales for electric vehicles in BC in 2024, and roughly 60% of residents polled in the Metro Vancouver and I believe Toronto, Greater Toronto area, were inclined to buy EVs as their next car. This was led by the Net Zero Dads and Moms segment, followed by Gen Green demographic clusters, which were the high 90 percentile and made up about a third of the urban and suburban populations, where the majority of residents live in rental housing and probably MURBs as well. Mm-hmm. But you generally come across a larger mix of like retired homeowners, practical families, and frugal skeptics living in more modern condos, like newer MURBs, like here in the Lower Mainland. So besides the knowledge gaps and the charging accessibility barriers, the infrastructure and electrical concerns were a top concern for MURB residents as a major barrier to purchasing an EV. So one of the important aspects that was covered in the data was that the younger generation were more inclined to and had a higher likelihood of buying EVs versus the older demographic. And one of the things preventing them from doing so is because they didn't feel that they were in a place where they could actually install charging easily. Mm-hmm. And that's an obvious barrier in that context. So can you cover some of the solutions that were outlined from the research and try to alleviate some of those concerns?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah. And yeah, there is a lot of, generational differences are really interesting on this. So in Metro Vancouver, that 60% is actually 70%. So interest and openness to electric cars is higher in Toronto than it is in Vancouver. I think that largely can be attributed to a network effect. There have just been a lot more EVs sold in BC because of a long history of supportive policy in this province. Mm-hmm. People have way more exposure to them. And actually, we did see that people who knew someone who had an electric car and who'd been in it were more inclined to get an EV themselves. So I actually think we see that happening in Vancouver. That's why it's 10 points ahead of Toronto, despite them being pretty similar cities in a lot of ways otherwise. Mm-hmm. But then among younger people in Metro Vancouver, so let's really zoom in here, mm-hmm. people who are under the age of 30, it's 82% who say they're inclined to go electric over a gas car. We surveyed this nationally recently, and it's 45, same question, same wording, 45% of Canadians are inclined to go electric. But you zoom in on young people in Metro Vancouver, and it's 82%. So, when you look at those national numbers, it's a lot of hot and cold, and when you zoom in on specific regions and specific demographics, it tells a totally different story. So it's really important that I don't think we've thought about it this way when it comes to policy, when it comes to unlocking drivers. Yeah. And, so we do know that these young folks who are more likely to live in condos, they're more likely to rent, are more inclined to get an electric car. We also know, because we ask people how much they drive, a lot of young families, especially in their 30s and 40s, are driving the most. So if you want to take an affordability lens on that, or take an emissions lens on that, getting people who drive more to electrify actually has a greater impact than people who don't use their car very much, like people who are retired, for example, who drive a bit less. Mm-hmm. So there is a strategy to focusing on these younger folks, and obviously, funding for getting charging into pre-existing MURBs is really important, a critical part of the solution. Building codes are very important. I mean, I see that as the low-hanging fruit. I mean, the stats that I've heard is that it's something like 3 to 4 times more expensive to retrofit a building with level 2 charging than it is to just build it there in the first place. Right. A lot of municipalities in BC do have requirements for this, I think over 30. Actually, I believe there are more municipalities in BC that have charging requirements for new builds than the rest of Canada combined, although Quebec has some province level mm-hmm. requirements. But which is actually what we'd like to see in the province and federally as well, is building in electrical codes that mandate this. Because if you believe, and I certainly do, that ultimately everybody who drives is going to drive an electric car, and you're building new buildings that don't have charging into it, you're just deciding that somebody else is going to pay 3 to 4 times more to install that charging after the fact. Right. So that's table stakes. I mean, let's start with that, and then of course, like I said, helping people who rent, who don't have parking spaces, getting more public charging. There's a big menu of solutions that together are going to work to solve this problem.
Yeah, absolutely agree, and that's certainly what we see from our standpoint as EV advisors, trying to encourage, people living in MURBs and specifically that we provide advice for, to have more of a long view on any retrofits that they do on their buildings, that this is something that is obviously encouraged through the rebate program in the amounts that are provided for stratas to do these retrofits, and it's only geared towards existing buildings, not the new buildings that are already EV ready in most jurisdictions, at least in Metro Vancouver. So what are maybe some of the key opportunities and barriers facing EV charging in these MURBs, and how do we get all buildings to be EV ready, or at least EV capable?
Yeah, well, like I said, we need it in the building and the electrical code. At those higher government levels, I think it's great that municipalities have stepped up.
Yep.
And I often get emails from people who work for cities asking what they can do, because cities often don't have the money, and they don't have the levers that the province and the federal government does have. And this is actually one area, and we've seen it play out here in BC, where municipalities can make a real difference. And it is an affordability solution, as we talked about. It is going to save people money. I think, now if you look at new construction, let's talk about the context of new construction here, because of course the story across the country is that it is down, down, down. And it seems to me that a lot of the new buildings that are going up are rental buildings, because developers basically are saying, I can't make money selling these, I'm just going to lose money. So the only type of building that's viable in a lot of cases now are rental buildings. So the amount of rental stock that's going online relative to condos has increased a lot. And I think the business case there for those developers, what I'll say, is extremely strong for putting charging in, because if you're building condos to sell, your hands are cleared of that building once you've sold all the units.
Yeah.
If you're going to own and operate a rental building, it's not somebody else's problem if you don't have charging in 5-10 years. That's going to be your problem. And do you want to pay 3 to 4 times more for that? So I think that an increase in rental stock is just a really easy sell to developers to get right.
Absolutely agree. Yeah. So getting back to the word empowering, because I really like that is your kind of key focus, and what the report in name says, empowering households, which includes MURBs, of course. As EV advisors, our service kind of mostly looks at the beginning of the process for stratas that want to go through putting EV charging in their buildings in a retrofit older building situation. And normally what we indicate is that they should first, establish an EV ready plan, which is part of the program through BC Hydro or Fortis BC in that territory here in BC, to at least get the rebate of up to $3,000 to conduct the plan through an electrical contractor or engineering firm that has the ability to basically plan out how each resident can have access to level 2 charging. They could also do an EPR, which is the electrical planning report, which is actually something that's required through the Ministry of Housing. There's no rebate associated with that, but often what we're finding is a lot of the contractors and whatnot that have been doing the EVRPs or the EV Ready plans are also doing the EPRs at the same time as different reports. But we're finding that just going through that process enables a lot of the residents to actually be empowered, just knowing, having that knowledge of what the capacity of the building is. Even if they're not looking at getting EV charging put in with the charger in place, ready to go, they'll at least have the level 2 infrastructure in place by going through this rebate initiative to make their building EV ready and, I guess, future-proofing in that sense. So would you agree that this process helps to empower residents with the knowledge that may be preventing them from proceeding otherwise?
Yeah. And we've seen that in strata boards or condo boards and stratas in multiple provinces that, people do vote for this who are not immediately getting an electric car. They understand that it makes sense. We're putting out actually with Plug and Drive, which is a great organization. They operate in the Greater Toronto area, and they basically let regular Torontonians test drive an EV to see if they enjoy the experience. So, and they have put out a condo guide in the past, but they wanted to update it and actually have it applicable for different provinces, including BC. And so we've been working on that with them, and we'll release that in November. So hopefully that is of some utility to anybody going through this process. But I think absolutely, like, having the ability to install charging, it does empower people, and it is more efficient for buildings to do these sort of batch upgrades than for people to have to individually upgrade their parking spaces. I said before that it's more efficient to build charging into a new construction than it is to retrofit. Well, it is more efficient for a building, residents to be organized and to do one big install than to have people individually pursue it.
Yeah, and it also kind of enables them to have that knowledge on not just EV charging capacity, but for anything such as heat pumps, which obviously your report goes into it as well at length as well. So in more simple and general terms, an EV-ready building is defined as a building which has charging infrastructure available for each unit in the building. Older buildings built before 2022 can have access to up to $120,000 or $600 per stall through this EV-ready retrofit rebate. And that would go towards the electrical retrofits, and they would have the additional $14,000 once the infrastructure was put in for the chargers themselves. So it'd be $1,400 per charger, up to $14,000. And that would be for level 2 network chargers as well. So has the implementation of the EV readiness by numerous municipalities in BC through the bylaws helped provide a more holistic approach in establishing a more future-proof solution for new buildings? And I know you were mentioning that BC, especially here in Greater Vancouver, have a much higher uptake, and maybe it's partially because of some of these initiatives that are in place. So maybe, would you consider EV readiness to be now the kind of baseline standard for MURBs, and is that something we should be seeking right across Canada?
Yeah, absolutely. So it is great. On the one hand, that we have, I believe, over 30 municipalities in BC that have charging requirements for EV readiness requirements for new builds. And on the other hand, we shouldn't need municipalities to have to lead on this, because it's more efficient to have a provincial and federal building code that has these requirements, so developers are not having to look at every individual jurisdiction and just check what are the requirements here, right? Now, I think the hope is if enough municipalities have requirements, eventually they just default on installing it, and I'm sure that happens in BC. But I don't know that it happens in Ontario, where the number of jurisdictions that have these requirements, I think, is under 10, and let alone other provinces in the country. So absolutely, it's having a positive effect here in BC, but an even more streamlined system would be one that is at the provincial and federal level, and that so developers just don't even need to think about it.
I agree. Yeah, because like looking at the demographics, but also at the landscape of what's being built. There's obviously many more Canadians living in MURBs, especially in the metropolitan areas like Vancouver and Toronto and Montreal. But just knowing the percentage of people that actually live in MURBs is something that should be considered when I think policies being considered.
So almost all new construction too is MURBs. It's not that much, so that's only going to increase.
Absolutely, yeah. So the upfront cost to EVs is still consistently regarded as the biggest barrier to greater EV adoption. And I know Clean Energy Canada's recent Missing Out report on lower-priced EVs globally points to Canada's affordable EV problem. where only 1 out of 21 EVs available in Europe sold for less than $40,000 Canadian. How can we open the gates to more affordable options in BC while we wait federal and provincial rebates to return? And can you speak to the report's findings and how we can solve it?
Sure. So it was 21 EVs in Europe were selling for less than the equivalent of 40,000 Canadian.
Right.
And so that is quite remarkable information because only one car sold in Canada sells for less than 40,000 Canadian MSRP.
Okay, right.
So,
Gotcha.
and that is a Fiat, and it's a cool car, but it only has 225 kilometers of range, and it probably isn't going to fit a family.
Mm-hmm.
So it isn't a car for the everyman. We did have a car that was very popular that was just under $40,000 and worked for a lot of people. And it was a Chevrolet Bolt. And it had over 400 kilometers range, enough room for a family, a very practical hatchback. And it was discontinued in late 2023. First it was canned, and then it was upgraded to paused. Supposedly it's coming out next year. We don't know at what price. Is it still going to be under $40,000? We see a lot of automakers here just deciding that the floor in Canada is $45,000. That just happened with the Nissan Leaf. It's going to be $30,000 in America and starting at $45,000 in Canada. And the currency difference does not account for all of that. We just don't get the cheapest base model here in Canada.
Right.
So it's not as if these EVs haven't existed in the past, and they certainly exist elsewhere. It's not just Chinese cars. So we looked at Europe and we see, okay, there are 21 cars. If they all existed in Canada and if they were just the same price but in Canadian dollars, 21 cars. One of them was the Fiat. So one thing on the list is here in Canada, and it is under 40K. Mm-hmm. Only 7 of them were Chinese. Obviously, that's adding competition. Volkswagen is putting out this new economy EV it announced about a month ago, and it sounds like it's a direct response to competition from Chinese electric cars. But again, 10 of these vehicles under 40K are from European automakers. So when we look at our survey work, and I've looked at others as well, like the number one barrier to people buying an EV, and it honestly should be obvious, it's the upfront cost. And I would add to that about 6 in 10 Canadians correctly know that an electric car will save them money over time. Mm-hmm. So there are a lot of people who both simultaneously recognize an electric car will save them money in the long run and still say that upfront cost is too much for them to bear. We talked about young people and barriers that they have in housing. Well, if you're trying to get a mortgage, you don't necessarily want to take out bigger debt and decrease the size of the mortgage that you're allowed to take out. You're probably prioritizing your house before your car, and you're trying to get the biggest mortgage you can, right? Mm-hmm. So even if this electric car is going to save you money over a decade, the bank isn't factoring that in. They're only factoring in the size of the car loan that you took out. Right. It is really important to people that we're able to get that upfront cost down. And we do have a competition problem in this country. We have 100% tariff on Chinese EVs, and we're very tethered to the American car market that, they have produced some good EVs, but they're not as all in on EVs as we see with European and certainly Chinese automakers. Mm-hmm. So absolutely number one problem to fix.
Yeah, and as you mentioned earlier, a lot of connotations, especially a few, 5+ years ago, where most of the vehicles were more luxury vehicles, and out of reach for this same segment. So there's been more of a kind of top-down in the reduction of price and models based on just the battery technologies, I would say mostly, and just how that's gotten so much cheaper so quickly. And I don't think it was anticipated that batteries for vehicles we're almost on par. We're very close. It's definitely something to consider that people that might be on the fence or have been on the fence we're getting closer to a time where hopefully we can not perceive EVs to be that kind of out of reach luxury vehicle, right? So looking at BC now, where despite significant investments in, say, hydrogen and things like that over the years, there's no car manufacturing sector per se. BC does have a very clean grid of mostly hydropower and plenty of, there's a bit of wind as well in there. But there's plenty of raw materials that are produced here, through mining to support battery supply chain in high demand, and it's definitely something that is percolating as a very hot topic right now in this whole trade geopolitical dilemmas that we're seeing. So do you see potential, for manufacturing of electric vehicles and batteries even here in BC? Is that something that's completely out of the perception of most people here, that they wouldn't consider it?
Well, I can't crystal ball BC's economic future. If I were to suspect things, I think that BC will absolutely benefit from and have a role in electric transportation. I suspect it will look different than it would look in Ontario, which obviously has a long automaking ecosystem and history. I don't, will we have a large, vehicle manufacturing plant? I'm not sure. I mean, obviously we've had some upstarts like Electromechanica, for example. I mean, that one-seater EV, the Solo. Mm-hmm. I think there's some other, maybe some MHDV companies. I know Green Power Bus. I don't know what they're doing these days. Battery manufacturing might be something that's a little more likely. Or battery recycling, for example. Mm-hmm. But there's a lot more to the electric transportation ecosystem than just building the vehicles themselves. Mm-hmm. Vancouver is one of the mining capitals of the world. Mm-hmm. And so it's not just like the actual mining sites, but it's the headquarters here in Vancouver. That is really tied to this transition. It's absolutely a way that BC is going to benefit. Yeah. And then just on the ground, there are all these small and medium-sized BC-owned businesses that install electric charging, for example, right? Yeah. I've seen, a bunch of SMEs that exist that didn't exist 10 years ago because people are spending their money charging their cars, spending a lot less money charging their cars, but it's a local company that's installing that charger, and then it's a public utility, BC Hydro, that we're buying electricity from as opposed to a fossil fuel company. So I think electric transportation will play a big role in BC's economy. It doesn't need to look like we're Southern Ontario for that to be true.
Yeah, I think that's especially interesting considering the kind of situation we're in right now, where we're really looking at different trading partners potentially, and the whole Elbows Up campaign that just transpired through the federal election and whatnot, and I think the messaging that was resonating this whole time is that hey, we have to realize what we have, ourselves. BC has a lot of mining, a lot of the things that the world needs. So we don't necessarily have to start from scratch and have an EV manufacturing sector, although I don't think it's unfeasible. Certainly could happen. We certainly have the talent here, and we could be producing at least components of batteries and parts and whatnot. We produce steel and aluminum in Canada, and that's a sector that's been very heavily targeted. So there's a lot of I think pluses, benefits to at least looking at the possibility of not underestimating ourselves, but to actually lean into potential growth in actually pursuing and helping to be a driver of this shift in transportation in particular, but also just the whole renewable energy sectors as well. But it's good to hear that these reports and the current data is looking at these trends so effectively. So we both drive EVs. I think we talked about this earlier, and we've been a part of observing the barriers that have been in place. There's a lot of talk, I think, especially 10 years ago, on the whole range anxiety element that you don't really hear much of anymore, which I think is a good thing. I think a lot of that has to do with just the range increasing over time, just as a general rule. Batteries obviously have been a big component of that, so they've been improving. And the lack of charging is also something that we're not hearing so much anymore as well, and I think largely because of the roles that the utilities here in BC have enabled a lot of the charging for especially fast charging, DC charging throughout the province and like the main networks of highways in the province. So what findings can you share with us on like encouraging residents to actually take the plunge and to get EVs from your findings in regards to your experience as well as maybe your findings through the reports?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think, well, at a high level, I think one of the things we were trying to get across with this report is that we shouldn't just think about electric vehicle uptake and demand as a direct result of interest and popularity, because we see a huge gap between the number of people who say they're inclined to get an electric car and the number of people who are buying an electric car, especially in 2025. And so, I think, first things first is, well, they're both important things, but really zeroing in on why is that? Why are people who want to buy these cars not buying these cars? And, there, of course, we see barriers. We're talking about that, obviously, a lot. Lack of charging in MURBs is a huge one. Upfront price is absolutely a huge one. We need to get in those cheaper European cars into Canada, and I think we can do that by adopting European safety standards that would allow those cars to be sold here in the country. That would be great. And so, I think that we really should just focus on the barriers, and as opposed to this idea that it's that people aren't sold on getting an electric car. But of course, I do talk to friends. I always subtly push them in the direction of getting an electric car. Like, I will say a lot of my friends, though, they buy used vehicles, and so it's a slightly different market. But there, I will point to the fact that in BC now, you can get a used Chevy Bolt for starting at around $20,000. So, like, this is a car that gets you over 400 kilometers of range and suits all your needs, especially in a place like Vancouver. $20,000 to $25,000. That's what it was on Auto Trader last time I checked. That's not much more expensive than an equivalent gas car. You're going to make that difference up in a year. That car's going to save you so much money. But what I will say about a robust used market is you need a robust new market. That is what feeds the used market. The used market actually takes care of itself if you get the new market working, which is why we need to keep in place Canada's and BC's EV mandates. Those are absolutely critical. Those are all about supply. And there's a reason why BC, why you can find so many Bolts for $20,000 to $25,000 is because historically we've sold a lot of EVs in this province, and the used market is going to suffer, and that's going to leave a lot of people out if we don't stay on top of the new market.
Absolutely. Speaking of like models and whatnot, what are your favorite? Like the three top, say, EVs on the market that are, it can be anywhere. It doesn't have to necessarily be in Canada, but what would you, and any reasons to back that up?
Yeah, it's just a funny question because it is a fun question for me, but for most of my life, I've not been a car guy. I really haven't been, despite growing up in Abbotsford. It is just not who I am. I did not actually own a car until I was in my 30s, and it was an electric car by the time I got around to buying one. But now I'm all in on EVs, and whenever there's an electric car driving by, I see it, I recognize it, and I probably know what model it is, but gas car, I couldn't tell you anything about gas cars. The ones that I'm eyeing the most right now that interest me, well, I'm all into more compact vehicles. I think that, city would be a nicer place if more people drove smaller vehicles. So the ones that I think look really cool, I think the Rivian R3 is very appealing to me. It's like a compact vehicle that's lifted, so it's practical without being too big. It's very nice looking, and I could see that as a next vehicle for me. I live in the Sunshine Coast now, and I drive a Model 3, so I can't really off-road with it. I do like that car. I mean, say what you want about Tesla, but it's been a great car. So yeah, the Rivian R3 is really appealing. And then, one of I've heard the Renault 5 is a great everyman EV. I was watching a video recently of these two guys driving around, and it's just stylish too. Like, it looks nice. It's really practical. So that one really appeals to me as well. Yeah, those are the two I'd say that are on my radar. Even though I find myself talking a lot about Chinese EVs these days. I did drive a BYD Dolphin this past summer. I was on a vacation with my wife in Iceland, and we rented an EV. And so I got there and they handed us the keys, and I'm like, oh, this is a BYD. Oh, this is interesting, because it's such a novelty as a Canadian.
Absolutely.
And so we drove the Dolphin, which is like the second cheapest BYD. There is one that's cheaper. Very equivalent to a Chevy Bolt, like very similar car. And, what I said about that car is that it was a good, solid car. It wasn't, I find there are people on both sides of this argument who have different motivations for wanting to act like current Chinese EVs are these like unicorns that, people think, oh, I could buy this $15,000 EV and it's better than anything Tesla's ever put out. It's like, that's not really true. Yeah. And on the other side of the fence, you've got people saying the same thing because they're like, well, if we lower this tariff, we're done. We're all scorched earth. Even though when you look at European markets, European EV markets, EVs typically are taking up less than 10%. Chinese EVs are typically taking up less than 10% of just those EV markets. So they're adding competition, but so far they're not taking over. And like my experience reflected that. This was a totally fine car, good price. Some people would be interested, but it's not like we're gonna, let the gate down and then the castle's flooded and it's done.
Very good take on all three of those, so I appreciate that. I'll digress on my three, but I think you actually got two of the three.
Oh, I'm curious now.
So yeah, just one last question for you. If you were to have like one wish granted, like you had a magic wand, and you could do one kind of policy change, or it doesn't have to be that, but if you were to change one thing, what would it be?
Well, what we've been all about this year is on Canada having a competitive EV market. Everything else is impermanent and political. Incentives are not going to last forever. An EV mandate is always at risk when a different government comes into power. But if we can make the market more competitive, that's a lot harder to undo, right? I mean, if we adopt European car standards, who's going to undo that? Even if we lower the tariff on Chinese EVs, and to be clear, we've always been on the position to lower it. We've never said scrap it. Is a new government going to want to come in and start a new trade war with China? I don't think so. It was actually, in the news today, the government was saying that they want to improve affordability by improving competition. And so, I think with the right levers, and I will say the EV availability standard does add some competition as well. And I hope it will last till 2035 and it won't be scrapped by some future government. But, even if it lasts half that time, it could still do some good. So creating the competitive conditions to get the EV market thriving and functioning and competitive on its own, so then it will take care of itself. And we don't need to have these hills and valleys like we have in 2025 when the BC incentive is frozen, the federal incentive is frozen, and everybody's just waiting to buy an EV, because why would you buy a car when you're told there might be a rebate coming back, but you haven't been given any clarity? We can't have hills and valleys like this.
Absolutely.
We got to improve the market in a lasting way.
Yeah, I think that brings it to, my favorite word of the moment right now that I keep hearing day in and day out, and it's certainty.
Yeah.
We need certainty. I think that's what's really lacking, and hopefully we'll find it. So thanks very much for coming to our offices today. Really appreciate it, and some very good insights. Hopefully that's helpful to the people out there listening as well. And yeah, very good to talk to you, and thanks very much for being with us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right, thanks. Plug-in BC strives to inform you with expert advice to assist you with your EV charging needs. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and review us wherever you get your podcasts or on this YouTube channel. Plug-in BC on our socials, LinkedIn, Instagram, and Facebook. You can also check us out on our informative website at pluginbc.ca, where you can also sign up for our newsletter. I'm J.M. Toriel, advising you to plug in BC.